Have you ever done something just to try to make yourself look cool in front of other people? Come on, you know we've all done it. I mean, just watch any video about epic fails and you will see people doing ridiculous things in front of other people. I'll be honest, when I was a cheerleader in high school, I'd kind of just started to learn how to do a backflip, and we were at a football game and I really wanted to try my backflip because I wanted to look really cool, and I bust my face on the ground. It was pretty crazy. And here's the truth, trying to look good in front of other people is normal because, well, I mean, we all want to look good. None of us hope to do something embarrassing in front of others. We don't just set out to show the worst version of ourselves. We want to put our best face forward, and there's a name for that. It's called managing your image, which is doing whatever you can to make sure the best parts of yourself are visible and your less likable parts are carefully hidden. And as crazy as that sounds, we all kind of get it. Everyone around us is thinking about managing our image in some way or another too. In some ways, sometimes high school feels like it's 5% academics, 5% social life, and like 90% trying not to look stupid. You know this is true because it's what you're doing when you tell your mom to drop you off 2 blocks away from school so your friends won't see her in your family's old minivan. It's why the idea of leaving the house in the morning when we have a bad hair day or a zit on our nose makes us just want to crawl in a hole. It's why there are certain people we want to be seen walking to class with, why we get more nervous playing football or performing the high school play in front of certain people, and why there's one class we really want to do well in. It's all because we are constantly working to manage our image so that we look good in front of people. Now, this isn't just a high school thing, by the way. This is a people thing. And just because we all do that to different extents doesn't mean it isn't exhausting. I mean, image management is a full-time job, people. And no matter how good you are at it, it still always feels slightly out of reach. And usually, at the end of the day, we feel, well, tired. That, by the way, is why some of us act like total weirdos at home. We've been containing our weirdness all day and we're exhausted. And on top of being exhausted, the whole not looking dumb thing is frustrating because it never works the way we think it will. All of us have that teacher, coach, friend, or even parent who, no matter what we do, how well we perform, how good our grades are, or how many accomplishments we have, aren't gonna be proud of us the way we want them to be. We can't do enough or say enough to change that. They'll just never approve. And when we do feel like we're looking okay, it never lasts as long as we think it will. I mean, one day we have it, and then one day it's gone. It just means we're starting all over again. Maybe we make an A, get the game ball, make first violin. I mean, it's really satisfying and rewarding. We go to bed that night feeling like we're just killing it at life, right? And then we wake up, and it starts all over. And you wonder, well, what if my grades fail and I get kicked off? What if I screw up the next game? What if second chair violin practices and gets better than me? I'm depressed just thinking about it. I mean, so why are we talking about this constant battle to manage how people see us? Because it's killing us. And here's a sneak peek at where we're going. Very few things will threaten your freedom like image management. I mean, it is the opposite of freedom. Freedom is the ability to act without restriction, and when we are constantly working around the need for approval, we're not free. Our need for approval is controlling us. Our need to manage our image is making us a slave. Last time we talked about how Jesus wants us to be free people, but what do we do if the fight for approval takes up our lives and keeps us from feeling anything but free? We started talking about the letter to the Galatians last week. It was a letter Paul wrote to a church who had heard the message of Jesus from Paul, but who had other teachers follow up with the Galatians. And these other teachers were teaching something different from what Paul had originally shared. I mean, Paul's message was, Jesus saved you. You're free from sin. Jesus made the relationship between you and God right. And these other guys came around saying, not so fast. Actually, you kind of have to keep these Jewish commands too for the whole salvation thing to really take. This made Paul very upset. I mean, remember when you were little and you worked for hours to build a Lego tower and your younger sibling would walk by and knock it down? It was kind of like that, but more annoying and way more important. That's how Paul felt. Paul had poured his heart into these people. And when these other teachers came around teaching them something that was nowhere near the true message of Jesus, Paul took it personally. That's why he was super clear in this letter in order to set the record straight. So Paul opens the letter saying this, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ. and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. Those are pretty direct words. And now look what Paul says a few verses later. Obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. Basically, Paul is saying, I'm probably gonna make you mad with what I say here as I set the record straight, but I'm not here for your approval. That's really saying something because Paul had plenty of enemies. He was on the run for his life through most of the story of the New Testament, from the government and also from Jewish leaders who saw him as a traitor to Judaism because he had decided to follow Jesus. But the church in Galatia should have been different. He planted this church and had a loving relationship with them. I mean, they were on the same team. But Paul knew they had heard something different about what following Jesus meant, and he wasn't okay with it. So he took a chance at rocking the boat, potentially even jeopardizing the relationship so he could clear things up. Why, you ask? Because the message of Jesus was on the line. A message that says freedom from sin can happen without the burden of people having to make their relationship with God right through their behavior. Paul had to make a decision. Did he care more about managing what people thought of him? Or did he want to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the real message of Jesus, a message of freedom and grace, was being preached? Basically, it was a decision between working for the approval of man or the approval of God. Paul spoke those words at the very beginning of the letter because he wanted to set the stage for the rest of the letter. Let's go back to what he said. Obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. See, Paul was more concerned with what he thought was right by God than what people would say or think about him. And maybe you think that sounds sort of harsh, but I mean, he wasn't just being a jerk. Going after the approval of God doesn't mean that you have permission to act in such a way that no one likes you. I mean, that wasn't what Paul was trying to do. Going after the approval of God does not mean losing the respect of others. In fact, in the next verse, Paul addresses the church in Galatia as brothers and sisters. He obviously cared about his relationship with them. Paul said what he said because he cared about the church and the people who made the church up, and not just about what they thought about him. You see, Paul knew that to only care about the approval of the men and women in Galatia was to make his own needs for approval more important than what they actually needed to be, because they actually needed the gospel. They needed the truth. So he told them, even at risk of how they would take it. Paul was basically saying there's a difference between caring about something and being controlled by it. He cared about the people who made up this church. He cared about the influence he had in their lives. He cared about having influence with them, but he was not controlled by the need for their approval. And that's an important distinction. That small difference is what kept him from being controlled by whether or not they approved of him, because Paul knew that free people live for God, not for the approval of others. Put even more simply, free people live for him, not them. But that's not always easy to do. It's not always easy to care what others think and not be controlled by the approval of others. So, how do you know if you're being controlled by the approval of others? Let me give you a few indicators. If you're willing to do things when people are around that you wouldn't do if you were alone, you may be controlled by the approval of others. If what other people say to you or think about you, I mean, whether it's a coach or a group of friends, changes how you feel about yourself, you may be controlled by the approval of others. If you feel like you're living different lives depending on the group you're hanging out with, being one way with one group of friends, another way with a different group, another way with your family, another way at church, you may be controlled by the approval of others. If there's a church version of you and a school version of you and a home version of you, you may be controlled by the approval of others. And here's why that matters. You weren't made to be controlled by anything. Remember, Jesus wants us to be free people, and free people don't live with every action being controlled by how others see them. Now, here's what Paul was not saying. I'm seeking the approval of God, so it doesn't matter how I treat everybody else. That's not what he meant. And I think it's important for those of us who are Christians to think about that. I mean, sometimes we can just be obsessed with managing our image as a super Christian that we act like we're better than other people. We don't always realize it, but that's not freedom either. That's still being controlled by our need to look a certain way. Now, before we wrap up, I want to get personal for a second. Chances are there's at least one relationship in your life where you care way more about your image and about their approval of you than you should. A relationship where, if you were honest, they have more control over you and your emotions and your view of yourself than you'd like to admit. And that's true for me. I mean, it's probably true for all of us. Chances are, they don't mean to have that influence on you. In fact, they probably don't even notice, but you care so much about what they think. Maybe people have even noticed it about you. Maybe someone has said something to you about how you change the way you talk or act around that person. And the question is, what do you do? Well, a couple of chapters later, in his letter to the Galatians, Paul says this: "Pay careful attention to your own work, for then you will get the satisfaction of a job well done, and you won't need to compare yourself to anyone else. For we are each responsible for our own conduct." Paul pretty much sums it up right there. You worry about you. You are responsible for yourself. You don't want to be a background player in your own life. You don't have to let someone else's opinion drive your decisions. The responsibility for you lies with you. In a way, it's like Paul is saying, you do you. Not because he didn't care about what others thought, but because I think he understood what we sometimes miss. You don't need others to give you what you already have. You don't need their approval because the God who made you already approves of you. He's crazy about you. Free people live with this mind, caring about the approval of God and not them. And when they do that, they feel a lot more free. They are free from the control of others' opinions. They are free from the burden of trying to measure up. They are free to rest in what God has done for them and don't worry about trying to live up to any other standard. Now, before you go to small groups, I want you to imagine how different your life would be if you didn't feel the pressure to manage your image all the time or get the approval of others. What would it look like if you started to live as though you believed what God has done for you is enough and no one can add or take away from that? How many hours would you get back? How much less stressed, less tired, less fake, and less worried would you be? It sounds nice, right? And that's what Paul wanted for the Galatians, and that's what Jesus wants for you. Because as we learned last week, he wants us to be free, and free people live for him, not them.